using video game technology. We'll talk about how video game design has been used successfully to train medical professionals at scale with lessons and techniques that are relevant not only in medicine, but in education in general. But in medicine, the stakes are especially high, and the tools that medical professionals have been given are, well, especially bad. And the problem, like many other problems in our healthcare system, this education problem was further exacerbated by COVID. And we'll talk about that and how video game technology and design has helped us overcome at least some of those gaps. Now, pre-COVID, I had promised Deborah that I would do a live surgery on stage at this event. Now that the event is online, there is no physical stage. So instead, I'm going to perform surgery live. But in addition to that, I'm also going to have two people do surgery remotely from two different locations, for training. So let's get into it. First, a little bit of myself and my own background. I've spent my career not in the healthcare or the education space. I've spent my career in the video games industry. I started out at LucasArts, Lucasfilm, making Star Wars games, spent many years at Microsoft, leading a video game technology team that created and defined some of the many technologies that are used in the Xbox game console, on your PC, and eventually 10 years later, make their way onto your phone. Now, one of the key elements of my team's job at Microsoft was to predict and plan the next 10 years of video game graphics technology. So we could go from characters that looked like this at the turn of the millennium. They looked human-like, but they still look clearly computer generated, and to go to characters that look like this, right? So this is an interactive character in a modern video game. So today, if I purchase a $50 game at my favorite video game store or online, I have a scene with dozens of soldiers on screen at once, explosions, animations. I can literally zoom into the eye of one of these completely interactive characters, and this is the level at which we are modeling video game characters today, right? So when you buy a $50 video game, you zoom into the eye of one of the characters, this is what it looks like. We have 5 or 6 layers just recreating the way light bounces around in the eye, okay? This is the cutting edge of interactive entertainment. Now let's contrast that to the cutting edge of education, specifically healthcare and medical training. Let's sit down in front of the best simulation center, let's say in the Chicago area. I'm based here in Chicago. And sit down in front of a cutting edge $250,000 ophthalmology simulator to train eye surgeons. This is what it looks like. For those of us that play video games, this is straight out of 1992. The veins literally look like they were scribbled on in crayon by my 3-year-old. And in contrast to the video game, where the eye is just an afterthought to make the character a little bit more engaging, here the eye is the entire focus of the product. So there is a massive gap between the state of the art in video game technology and what we see in the state of the art of medical training. And it's not just the visual quality. That simulator that we see can't capture the most difficult and challenging cases that you might encounter in eye surgery because it's technically incapable of doing it. So again, there's this massive gap. And it's not just the technology that forms that gap. There's also what we call the neuroscience gap. Now, the games industry has developed this incredibly deep discipline over the last 3 decades that we've tested on over 1 billion players. Video game designers have figured out the neurochemical recipe for changing behavior and driving learning at scale among any audience, and it is incredibly effective. Case in point that many of us are familiar with. So the last administration, we spent a good part of a decade and around $2 to $3 billion to try to stem the obesity epidemic, to try to get overweight Americans off the couch and just go for a walk. And these meritorious efforts were all eclipsed, like all these efforts that were taken in the government were eclipsed in 48 hours by a single video game that got tens of millions of Americans outside and walking for miles. This is the power of video games to change behavior at scale. Now, we all know about Pokemon Go, right? We all experienced, the downtown of our respective cities turning into a zombie apocalypse for weeks on end. But every game is actually doing this, even if it's not trying to get you to walk around strange neighborhoods. Every video game is changing your behavior, whether it's getting you to go for a walk or getting you to pick up your phone every day to play, getting you to invite your friends. Video games drive user behavior. And there's a reason why tens of millions of those players can name 80 Pokemon characters and give you their entire backstory, but they can't show you where Switzerland is on the map. This is because video games are incredibly good at driving learning as an indirect or unintended consequence of play. Now, the actual mechanics that go into designing these games is becoming incredibly sophisticated. So when we're talking about this incredible ability of video games to change behavior, to drive retention of knowledge, but also to improve skill. And so the example I'll give here is from Angry Birds. And for many of us, Angry Birds is still played today, right? You can go and see people are literally still playing this game 10 years after it came out. Why is that? Have you ever wondered why Angry Birds is so addictive? It's actually evolutionary. So if you think back to the first time you played Angry Birds, what happened? You pulled the bird back in the slingshot, you fired at the Tower of Pigs, and you missed. And you got frustrated, and all the pigs laughed at you. And the second bird pulled into the slingshot, you pulled it back, you aimed a little bit better, you fired, you got a little bit closer to the tower, but you still missed. And that frustration built up. And then the third bird hopped into the slingshot. You pulled it back, you fired, and it was glorious. There were explosions, animations, pigs flying everywhere. The music changed. Why was this? All of this was deliberately designed to trigger a dopamine release in your brain that literally reinforced the neural pathways that you used on the last fire. That's how you learned to play the game, which is also what made the game so rewarding. That's how 2 hours later, you're firing that bird between two narrow obstacles at 50 yards, and why 60 hours later, you're still playing the game. We didn't invent this mechanic in the video games industry. This neuromechanic has existed for tens of millions of years. This is how your ancestors learned how to throw a spear, by throwing and missing, and building up frustration until you finally hit the target, which triggered the release of dopamine and triggered learning. This is how the mammalian neuron has learned for tens of millions of years. This is one of thousands of tools in the game designer's toolbox. The game designer who knows how to perfectly balance reward and frustration, skill and challenge to keep the player in a flow state and keep them learning and keep them engaged. And myself, what I understood by accident was that when you unleash both this technology and the neuroscience of game design on unsuspecting doctors, you can get some powerful results. So, like I said, I've spent my career in the video games business, which has made me a little bit of the disgrace of the family because I'm the first one to not go to medical school. My grandfather was a famous doctor. My parents are doctors. My wife is a doctor. And I'm the one who went on to go make video games. So eventually in 2012, my parents gave up and they realized it was too late. I was never going to go to medical school. And so my father says, all right, Sam, at least if you're going to do this, put all this gaming nonsense to good use. Make me a fiber optic laryngoscopy simulator to train my colleagues how to do this procedure. Put all this gaming tech to good use. He goes, this is a very visual procedure that we have to do, and it's especially difficult. We only do it on rare and difficult cases. So even experienced anesthesiologists will struggle with it if they haven't done enough. It's very hard to train. You only learn by repeated practice on live patients that present more and more difficult scenarios. So he goes, just make me a game that'll run on my friends' iPhones. Now, I was busy running a video game company at the time, making games for Hollywood movies. And so basically, to get my father off my back, I hacked together a quick little game in 3 weekends, and I uploaded it to the App Store. And I did that because I was too busy running another game company to install it on his friends' iPhones one by one. Through the App Store, they could just download the link themselves and leave me alone. 2 years later, my father calls me up and he says, hey, Sam, how many people downloaded that thing? And I go, I have no idea, but I can check for you. I went and I looked, and we had 100,000 doctors, nurses, and airway specialists worldwide who'd been playing this game. And so to try to figure this out, I typed it into Google, and I discovered, unbeknownst to me, they'd been doing efficacy studies on this crappy little game I made for my father that showed it was improving physician performance. And they were doing these studies at academic institutions around the world. And that was the motivation for starting Levelx. Basically saying, look, clearly there's demand, right? And there's potential here. What if we actually put together a team of top game developers to focus directly on this problem, to advance the practice of medicine through play, use video game technology and design to help physicians improve skills that they otherwise would only be able to improve and develop by practicing on live patients, right? Let's use the technology and neuroscience of games to accelerate the adoption curve of new techniques and new technologies in healthcare. Again, techniques that you might otherwise only get to really practice on live patients. And so what if we put together, not just me working with my dad, but a team of dozens of the top video game designers and artists and engineers from across the industry, folks who've worked on everything from Mortal Kombat and Call of Duty to Words with Friends. And we team them up with hundreds of physician contributors and advisors, experts in their field, to go and capture the most difficult challenges of the practice of medicine as video game mechanics, working hand in hand with dozens of leading biotech companies, life science companies, medical device companies, medical societies, as well as NASA, who are starting to use this technology through a grant from the Translational Research Institute for Space Health to adapt this technology and this game design to help train astronauts for medical emergencies that they might encounter on deep space missions. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the potential. Now let's actually walk through some examples. So I'm going to demo everything here straight off of my phone. Let me make this a little smaller, and I'll make myself a little smaller. And so everything I'm demoing for you here, I'm literally demoing right off of my iPhone. Everything I'm showing you is available for free in the App Store. Everything I'm showing you here on mobile. So where I'm going to start is with GastroX. This is our gastroenterology game. There are over 700,000 medical professionals playing these games on mobile. GastroX has a few 100,000 that are playing. I always like to start a demo with a colonoscopy. I promised Deborah I'd do one live on stage, so here we'll do one live over this platform. So what this game is filled with are dozens of rare, difficult cases that have been submitted by doctors all across the country. Now, some of these cases you can earn CME credit for. So it's a video game where doctors can earn continuing medical education credit toward renewing their medical license. So here I'll go jump, but a lot of these cases are here just because they're challenging and rare and interesting. So here I'll start out by demoing. So as you can see, everything I'm doing here, I'm just doing live on my phone. This is not a video. This isn't an interactive video. This is a totally interactive virtual patient. What do I mean by that? Well, this patient is squishy. Literally, the tissue moves. I can grab anything anywhere. And you can see literally like the tissue glows as I move it toward the light. It behaves just like it would in a real patient. Now, this is a routine polypectomy. The challenge is finding all the hidden polyps that hide behind folds or in crevices. And here I can just use different tools to move the tissue out of the way, move the folds to try to find those polyps. And again, it behaves just like it would in real life. So here I can see there's a polyp that's a little bit out in the open. So I'll grab my forceps and I'll remove it. What I don't realize is this is a rare condition where the polyp embeds on a blood vessel. So when I remove it, I can trigger a bleed a meter inside the body. So here, as you can see, full 3D computational fluid dynamics running on a phone, that thing that drops your calls all the time. We can really capture the challenge of the procedure. I can come in and spray water to try to get the bleeding to stop, but that doesn't help. It just dilutes the blood. So here, I'll take more drastic action. I'll take my argon plasma coagulator. This is a real device. And I'll cauterize the wound from inside the body. And we'll seal it up. And as you can see, objective achieved, bleeding stopped. And now I have 4 more polyps to find under this mess of blood and water. We don't have time for me to go through that. So here I'll just cauterize. It's a totally interactive patient. I can cauterize anywhere until eventually I'll fail the case. And because it's a video game platform, we can literally track everything the user does, the decisions they make, the tools they choose, how long it takes, and we can deliver content that's built and designed to close whatever educational or knowledge or skill gaps that user might have. So next, I'll give another example. This is our pulmonology game. Before we get into COVID, so a number of these apps like our airway game and our pulmonology game and our cardiology game now feature COVID content, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, I'll demonstrate some non-COVID cases. Here's a case called Carpenters conundrum. This is a real case from the University of Chicago. This is what we call a physics puzzle. A carpenter was holding a bunch of nails in his mouth while he was hammering, accidentally inhaled one and punctured his bronchus. And so here, we'll come in to do the procedure. And here you can see the nail as it embedded in the patient's lung. Now, the naive approach here, what was done initially was the doctor came in, used his endoscopic forceps, tried to remove the nail. What he realized was no matter what angle he came in at, he simply could not get that nail to budge. It was too deeply embedded. So he goes, all right, well, look, I can bend my endoscope at the tip, but only in one direction. So, all right, what I need to do is totally reorient myself so my bend is in the direction of the nail. Twist my tools around, come in at the base, grab the nail, and now when I bend my endoscope, I can remove that nail. There we go. Now, and as you can see, this is a totally realistic physical environment. I can suction up, all the mucus is completely interactive, and I can go as deep as I want to into the lungs. And I don't lose any detail, even as I go 3 or 4 generations deep. So here what we're showing you are capturing some of the procedural challenges of the practice of medicine using video game mechanics. But medicine isn't just about procedural challenges. A lot of the challenges in medicine are cognitive. They're diagnosis, treatment, identifying patients, understanding a mental model of how complex systems work. And so now we'll explore how we can use video game mechanics to capture some of those challenges as well. And when we do that, we'll do that in the context of COVID. So let's talk a little bit. I'd like to talk a little bit about COVID and some of the challenges that this has created for us, and some of the endemic problems that it's revealed in our healthcare system, specifically in regard to medical education. So if COVID has shown us anything, it's revealed systemic problems in our healthcare system. Now, as I mentioned before, my wife is a physician. She sees COVID patients. And like much of the rest of the country, her clinic ran out of PPE at the beginning of the pandemic. So this picture here, this was actually me in my basement at the beginning of the pandemic at 2 o'clock in the morning. engineering makeshift PPE out of a snorkel mask, some CPAP filters, and a voice amplifier, and pressure testing it in my bathtub, right? COVID has exacerbated systemic problems in our healthcare system. And sadly, the training of medical professionals is no exception, right? We're facing COVID has illustrated some of the same problems that we've seen with PPE. We're seeing gaps in how doctors are able to train for new scenarios and new techniques. And so when COVID hit, we immediately got this wave of demand from our doctors and our nurses that are playing our games. Help, right? We need to be able, our tools to train and practice on a number of very difficult scenarios that have just arisen. Those tools are extremely limited. And so we said, all right, how can we help? So back in March, we said, look, one of the things that we learned was managing a COVID airway is extremely difficult, and produces and creates some unique challenges that are unique to COVID patients. So we said, look, we have a game already that trains doctors how to manage a patient airway, how to intubate a difficult patient to prepare them for a ventilator or to prepare them for surgery. And so we said, okay, well, clearly those guidelines don't work for COVID patients because COVID patient airways are friable, and some of the techniques that you might use can actually aerosolize the virus and create a danger for everybody in the room. And so we looked around for guidelines to figure out, okay, well, what's the best way to manage a patient's airway under COVID? And all we could find were a bunch of hastily assembled PDFs in Italian. Why in Italian? Because they'd been put together by the Italian anesthesia societies that were dealing with this emergency first, right? And even if your Italian is better than Google Translate, a major problem still remains, which is these guidelines are incredibly complex. You can't memorize them. They're these incredibly complex decision trees that involve all sorts of potential possibilities and the different decisions that you need to make based on what you see. You can't memorize this, especially if you're stressed out and sleep deprived. So the result in real life, you end up learning these complex guidelines through experience by making mistakes on live patients. Now, thankfully at Levelx, we had actually solved this problem a year prior, right? How to capture the challenge of guideline-based decision-making, and we were able to quickly adapt those game mechanics for COVID. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually demonstrate, an example running on our remote training system. So one of the challenges that COVID presented, not only were a bunch of new medical challenges, but also our modalities of training have now been forced to change. So historically, medical training took place in person, right? We would have a trainer, we would have a simulation center, we might have a cadaver lab, and everybody would get together for training. Now, unfortunately, with COVID, a lot of those venues are no longer available. It's hard enough to get people back into the hospital, let alone to put them into a lecture room or into a sim center or into a cadaver lab to train. And so all of this training has now been forced to move online, which we've gone from being able to interactively train over a patient or on a simulator to having to train basically by watching a PowerPoint presentation over Zoom or the web conferencing solution of your choice. So at Levelx, we captured and we transferred a bunch of technology that had been used in the video games industry for something called cloud gaming, right? The ability to have a group of people together playing on a simulation or on a machine that's actually running in a cloud environment. And we adapted that technology for remote medical training. And I'm going to show an example of that here. So I'm actually going to show you a case that's available in our mobile apps, but this version is actually running live, live in the cloud. And so I'm going to bring on Rosie, who is going to actually play this game with me remotely over Zoom. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on this window. Here we go. And here, basically, I'm going to interface with this on my computer while Rosie interfaces with it from her machine. So I'm based here in Chicago, she's based in Denver, and together we're going to go through the sequence of managing a patient, managing a sequence of patients with and without COVID, and learning to manage their airways. So here, like I said, it's guideline-based decision-making. The first patient that presents, this is a mechanic that we developed with the American Society of Anesthesiologists. This first patient is COVID negative, so we can follow the standard protocols. In fact, if I try to put on an N95 mask and put on PPE, it might warn me that, hey, you know what? That PPE might be needed for a patient that is confirmed COVID positive. And so here, I'm just going to go through the standard technique. I'm going to try to intubate the patient, whatever technique I use. The guidelines tell me if the technique fails, I want to try again using the same approach. And so I'll intubate the patient successfully, preparing him for surgery or for the ventilator. Now we're going to go into our first COVID case. So you can see I'm playing this game just here in my web browser that I clicked through a link. Rosie's behind a similar link available on her phone or through her web browser. And I'm going to go and I'm going to start this procedure. So this patient presents with COVID. We can see immediately her oxygen saturation is low. COVID patients come in with a low oxygen saturation, and when you try to intubate them, their oxygen saturation can drop catastrophically. So Rosie, why don't you go ahead? You can see I'm just going to leave my mouse here to the side. Go ahead and let's let's don some PPE and limit staff in the room. So go ahead and continue, and then limit staff in the room. Continue, perfect. Okay, now let's go and pre-oxygenate our patient. So here's your list of options. Rosie, go ahead and pick how are we going to pre-oxygenate our patient. Okay, mask ventilation. So here Rosie chose a mask ventilator, which is a perfectly fine approach in a normal scenario, but for a COVID patient, it can aerosolize the virus. So as you can see, our patient's oxygen saturation went up, but we used the wrong device, so we lost points, and our COVID-19 risk increased. So now we're going to go and we'll perform an awake intubation. Rosie, choose which device we're going to intubate the patient with. You've got a fiber optic, a video laryngoscope, direct. Perfect. Okay. Successfully intubated the patient. Now here it's warning you that a video laryngoscope is indicated when intubating a COVID-19 patient. So we can see every step of the way we can make the right decision, the wrong decision. And what we can do is we can compare those results against the standard of care. So normally you would read the guidelines and then just try it on different patients, and you would maybe make the wrong decision and then see the result. Here you can practice over and over and over again on dozens of different patient presentations, trying different approaches, understanding the implications of your decision, and then comparing the decisions that you made against the guidelines. And here, Rosie and I can do this together. So here she and I can manage a sequence of more and more difficult patients together. We can do this, her and I, we can do this in a group of 3 or 4 people, assigning different roles in patient care to different people who may be engaging with this from California, Denver, Boston, Chicago. We're all interfacing with the same virtual patient hosted and simulated in the cloud. So this patient presents, he just came in from a car accident. He's got a damaged airway, but he's COVID positive. And so this presents a whole slew of difficult complications. The decision-making here becomes incredibly complex. And I will leave this to the player. You can play these levels in Airway X, in our Airway X game. You can go through this sequence, try different approaches, and try to get to the optimum outcome for the patient in the least amount of time. So next, what I'm going to do, Rosie, is we're going to demonstrate, before I go into the next COVID case, I just want to demonstrate some of the capabilities of this remote platform. Going quickly. So here, just from a link, I'm going to demonstrate, this isn't just for going through clinical decision-making. Here we'll go back to a procedural example where we can do surgery live together remotely. So here we're logging into the same system. This is again running in a web browser. And here we're going to do knee surgery. So here on my computer, what I can do is I can place these retractors. and then I can start to open up the patient. And so Rosie in Denver, Rosie, I opened up the right side. Why don't you go ahead and open up the left?
All right, going ahead and doing this now.
Perfect. So here you can see, right, she and I are interacting and doing surgery on the same virtual patient that's actually simulated in the cloud, both of us from different cities. And so here you can have an entire surgical team or an audience of trainees that are all training in a virtual environment, just interacting from their browser or from their phone. The capabilities of the device don't matter because in this case, we're actually simulating it in the cloud. So here I can control the camera. So I can say for this knee replacement procedure, I can say, look, I'm going to place the cut guide. I can show it from different angles. I can show it from the perspective of the drill hole. I can also show it from the perspective of the femur. And then she and I can hand off different steps of the procedure. And we're all just interacting with the same virtual patient remotely. So here, Rosie's actually adjusting the cut guide rotation to adjust the configuration, and then I can insert it into the knee. So here you can see this is a capability, using video game technology, we can not only recreate a wide range of procedural and clinical challenges on a phone, we can also access that from a browser, from the cloud. And so again, using a combination of cloud gaming and mobile gaming technology, we're able to create educational training tools where multiple people can participate in the same environment. And so now I'm going to close this out and we'll walk through some more COVID examples. So here I'll turn my phone back on. So we talked about some of the clinical challenges that are presented by COVID. So we walked through an example of guideline-based decision-making. How do I prepare a patient who I might need to intubate before surgery or for the ventilator? What are the right guidelines so I can insert the tube effectively without causing damage to the patient or hurting the people around us? COVID presents a whole slew of other challenges that call upon completely different sets of skills. So here I'll go back to that Pulmex game that we were playing, right, where we were removing the nail from the patient's throat. And I'll go back to our selection and I'll jump into our COVID-19 cases. So very quickly as COVID spread, we were rapidly updating our games. And that's one of the benefits of mobile, is we can rapidly update these games every other week if we want to, with new guidelines as they develop. So here I'll show some examples from early on in the pandemic. One of the challenges that doctors face outside of surgery is diagnosis. Almost every physician and nurse and other medical professionals is faced with the challenge of having to diagnose a patient. Now, sometimes you don't actually get to see anything, right? You're diagnosing just based on a discussion or you're diagnosing based on test results. And so COVID is no exception to that. And in the case of COVID, some of the challenges that we were seeing was patients were still presenting to emergency rooms and to doctors with other lung conditions that presented like COVID, but weren't necessarily COVID. And so what we did was we created a sequence of 5 cases, 4 of which present like COVID, but aren't COVID. And we want to force you to use your deductive reasoning skills to eliminate those other, what we call differential diagnoses. And so here, I'll go into one of the cases, and this uses our diagnosis game mechanic. Let me go make this a little bigger. Perfect. Okay. So here, this is a mechanic that we actually developed long before COVID. We developed this to capture the challenge of diagnosis. And the way we did it was we took 2 of the top puzzle game designers in the country and we put them on the challenge of capturing medical diagnosis as a game mechanic. They came up with 20 different designs. We prototyped 8 of them, tested them on over 100 doctors and other diagnosticians until we converged on this one. Because what we don't want to do is present diagnosis as a multiple choice test, right? That doesn't truly capture the reductive reasoning challenge. And so here our patient presents with a chief complaint, and we get the basic stats, the basic vitals that we would get coming into the exam room, okay? Here we have 17 diseases that it could be, and we're not going to reward you for guessing the right answer. The challenge is, how do I ask the right questions and order the right tests in the right sequence to eliminate as many possibilities as I can as efficiently as possible? So here my patient presents, I can ask about chief complaint, I can ask about cough, and let's say, I can also perform a pulmonary exam, and I can ask about exposures and travel. So here we're able to recreate the challenges of diagnosis. In the case of COVID, some of these scenarios, you have a COVID test available. Early on, we presented a sequence of cases where you didn't necessarily, and you had to diagnose without an available COVID test. And so each test automatically eliminates a sequence of diseases, almost like Guess Who. And as I play through this, the suspense builds up, just like it does in Angry Birds, until I get this rewarding sequence. I've eliminated 12 diseases and I've narrowed down to 5. And I can look at those diseases and I can order different tests to try to eliminate those further. Let's say like a CBC to get the white blood cell count. And I can also ask about family history, for example, and see if we can further eliminate. So here, this is the difference between, okay, so my CBC eliminated 3 diseases, and now I'm down to 2. So what we're doing is, instead of just, turning this into a quiz, we're capturing we're drilling down into what are the challenges of the procedure, of the technique, of the diagnosis, and we're capturing that using the mechanics of video games, whether it's strategy games, whether it's puzzle games, whether it's physics games. We're able to adapt the technology and the design of games to capture those specific challenges and help doctors develop their skills, and do so on a sequence of half a dozen, dozens, potentially hundreds of different patient cases that might present in different ways. The last examples that I'll show, all of this also runs not only under some of the examples that we were showing, capture the challenges under visible light, right? We looked at surgery under from inside the body as well as from outside the body. Here, this is our Cardio X game. A quarter of the interventional cardiologists in the country are playing this game. And here, I can show an example of a game played entirely under X-ray. So in this case, we're capturing the challenges of interventional cardiology as a puzzle game played under X-ray. So here, this is what the heart looks like under X-ray. You can see the bones, but you can't see the heart very well. So in order to do it, you need to inject the radio-opaque toxic dye so you can see where you're going. Then I need to navigate my guide wires through a live beating human heart. And the challenge of this game is to understand which tools should I place in which configuration, in which sequence, in order to restore blood flow to the heart. And so here I can place a stent. So here I have a patient with a lesion, and I can place the stent along my guide wire, which has already been fed up through the femoral artery into the heart. And I can place it here at the base of this lesion, but I'm placing the wrong device in the wrong location. I'm using a covered stent, which is actually going to cover a side branch and block blood flow to a portion of the heart. Right, so here we're able to capture a wide range of the challenges of the practice of medicine, whether they're procedural, whether they're diagnostic, whether they're treatment, and we're able to do it using the mechanics of a video game. And these are games that I can play by myself to develop my skills, or I can play with colleagues simultaneously, where we can go through the challenge of managing a patient together, we can manage a patient together, we can perform surgery together, we can make a sequence of decisions together, and we can do it as a team. And so just like today, you've got hundreds of millions of people that are using video games to connect with each other that they couldn't play with in person. They're connecting over online gaming platforms, through party games, they're playing on social games, on mobile games, they're playing through cloud gaming platforms. We're able to adapt these technologies for medical training. But these same methodologies, these same techniques, these same design approaches can be applied to education in any discipline. And so on that note, we have a few minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I'll turn off my demo, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the audience? And if not, and I'm happy to then go and continue to demo anything else that anyone would like to see. Like I said, we have 4 games available today in the App Store. Just go search for Levelx, Level EX, and all those games will show up. We have games for gastroenterology, pulmonology, anesthesia, and cardiology. So you can see how these techniques are applied, with more coming soon across every major specialty in medicine. So I'm seeing here in the questions, have you thought about designing games specifically for nursing students? Well, yes, in fact, we actually have at this point tens of thousands, if not more, nurses and nursing students playing these games. And some of the cases that we get and some of the gaps that we try to fill have come from nurse anesthetists and other nurses in a range of specialties that are facing, specific challenges in their practice that we capture as video game mechanics. So especially when it comes to some of the challenges we presented here with COVID, managing a patient, diagnosing a patient, often these challenges fall to nurses. And so the same content is relevant across a range of disciplines within medicine. Next question, how do they earn CME credit from playing the video game? When you register, you provide your NPI number, your prescriber ID, and then when you complete specific CME cases, you'll receive an email with a certificate validating that you've earned AMA Category 1 CME credit for completing the case. And so all of the content that you see in our games has undergone peer review, right? Just like you would find in any medical journal or any conference presentation where the content has been reviewed by a panel of doctors and other medical professionals. When it comes to, for accuracy, when it comes to CME content, then we go through an additional layer of review to validate not only that the content is realistic, but also that it closes specific educational gaps. And so there's an additional level of review for CME content. Next question, is VR on the way to be incorporated into these kinds of games? Yes, we've actually created, the same content runs in VR. So we've actually created content that's been played by thousands of medical professionals in VR and tens of thousands in augmented reality using their phones. I can actually, you know what, in our last minute, I'll demo some augmented reality. Excuse me, my office is a little bit of a mess, but I'll demo that real quickly before we run out of time. So this is our Airway X game. There you saw it was prompting me to insert my NPI number, but I don't need CME credit. So here what I'm going to do, this is using augmented reality. So the same thing works in a VR headset, also works in an augmented reality environment. So here what I can do on my desk, this is teaching you how to use different devices to secure a patient's airway, to intubate a patient, to insert a breathing tube before putting them on a ventilator. And so here, this is the traditional technique.